Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we've got another season preview video. In today's video, we're looking at the last two teams in the Atlantic Division, Buffalo and Detroit, two of the teams who have the longest playoff droughts. How did they do last year, how did they do this offseason, and how are they shaping up going into the 2025-2026 season, which are all the updates regarding these two teams coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Now before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to do this without you guys. So if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to leave a comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. And don't forget to stay tuned for more videos coming out in the very near future. So as per usual, a season preview video. Only 4 left, including this one. So our season preview series is coming to an end. Today we're looking at Buffalo and Detroit. So as per usual, we'll look at last year's stats. We'll look at their additions and subtractions in the offseason. We'll look at the big trades that they made. We'll look at their top 3 draft picks in the 2025 draft. We'll look back at my offseason preview video and look at 5 things I said this team should do in the offseason to get better for next year. And I'll also give you my predictions for their lineup for the 25-26 season, my team predictions for the 25-26 season, and my offseason grade. So we're going to start with the Buffalo Sabres here. Last year, a subpar season from Buffalo. They picked up towards the end of the season, but I think they had like a 14-game losing streak at one point. It was awful turmoil in Buffalo, missing the playoffs for the 14th straight year, finishing with a record of 36-39-7 for 79 points, 7th in the Atlantic, 14th in the Eastern Conference, and 26th in the entire NHL. Like it was a bad season from the Buffalo Sabres. And I mean, there were really no bright spots for Buffalo. They had 265 goals for, which isn't overly bad, but 287 goals against. They had a minus 22 rating. Not the best of the plus minus categories. Only had a minus 4 worse than the Montreal. And they actually did do quite good on the goal scoring side, but goals against wise, like they were awful, man. So that's a big reason as to why they missed the playoffs again. If you look at their point goal scoring leaders in the regular season, Thompson led a team with 72 points, followed by Dahlin and Peterka, who both had 68. And Thompson led a team with 44 goals, followed by Tuck with 36, and Peterka, who had 27. So Peterka, Thompson were 2 of the drivers offensively for the Sabres last year. Dahlin had another really good season. Tuck had a brilliant season goal scoring last year. So some really solid seasons from some players from Buffalo. It just wasn't enough to get them past into the playoffs. So very interesting out there. This team missed the playoffs, so there's no other stats to go off of here for the Buffalo Sabres. Next, going over to the offseason additions and subtractions for the Buffalo Sabres. So it's a pretty long list here. The Buffalo Sabres added Gibson and Danforth from Columbus, Carson Mayer from Anaheim, Josh Doan from Utah on a trade, Jake Leschyshyn from the Rangers, Zach Jones from the Rangers, Michael Kesselring from Utah in a trade, Isaac Beliveau and Connor Timmins from Pittsburgh in a trade, Alex Georgiev, Alex Lyon, and the Chicago Blackhawks 2026 6th round pick. Well, they lost Lucas Rusek, who's a UFA, Sam Lafferty, who was traded to Chicago, JJ Peterka, who was traded to Utah, Tyler Tullio, who's a UFA, Jacob Bernard-Docker to Detroit, Eric Brandstrom, who's a UFA, Connor Clifton to Pittsburgh in a trade. They lost Kel Clegg to Winnipeg, Reimer and Sandstrom to UFA status, and a 2025 second round pick in a trade with Pittsburgh. So all in all, some very interesting movement here. If you look at the goaltending side, they lose Reimer and Soderstrom and they get Lyon and Georgiev. I don't think Georgiev's a really good goaltender right now, given how he did last year. I think Lyon can be a suitable backup / third stringer. I think to some extent they actually got better on the goaltending side, especially with the addition of Lyon, who can be a serviceable backup. So not bad moves there on the goaltending side. Defensively, they lose Jacob Bernard-Docker, who was a trade deadline acquisition, Eric Brandstrom, who was a trade deadline acquisition, as well as Connor Clifton, who was entering the final year of his deal, and Kel Clegg, who was mostly an AHL level player. They had Isaac Beliveau, who will most likely be an AHL / ECHL level player next year. Connor Timmins, who can be a decent third pair defenseman. Zach Jones, who can also challenge for like third pair roles. And Michael Kesselring, who's going to be a very solid defensive minded top 4 right shot defenseman for this Buffalo Sabres team. So if you look at this team, they did lose a little bit of depth and some pretty good players like Jacob Bernard-Docker, like Brandstrom, to some extent like Clifton, but I think Jones and Timmins will both be able to challenge with third pair roles, and Kesselring's going to be a really solid top 4 defenseman. I do think they actually improved defensively. And up front, they lost Tyler Tullio, JJ Peterka, Sam Lafferty, and Lucas Rusek. Well, they added Jake Leschyshyn, Josh Doan, Carson Mayer, and Justin Danforth. Mayer and Leschyshyn are both going to be AHL level players, call-up options. Danforth, a solid bottom 6 guy. Doan, a solid top 9 forward. They lose all bottom six forward in Lafferty, some call-up options in Tulio and Rusek, but Peterka, who was one of their best offensive weapons the entirety of last year, they lose. So that's going to be a bad blow. So all in all, I think defensively this team got better. I think goaltending-wise this team got better. I can't say forward group got a little bit better because they lost one of their offensive point drivers. So very interesting note there. This team made 3 trades this past offseason. They traded JJ Peterka to Utah for Josh Doan and Michael Kesselring. They traded Connor Clifton and a 2025 second-round pick to Pittsburgh in exchange for Isaac Beliveau and Connor Timmins. And they traded a 2026 sixth-round pick, or acquired, actually, from the Chicago Blackhawks in exchange for Sam Lafferty. So 3 very intriguing deals the Buffalo Sabres made. So very interesting note there. Next, going over to their top 3 draft picks in the 2025 draft. So their first pick was in the first round, 9th overall, to Russian defenseman Murka. Their second pick was in the third round, 71st overall, and they took Russian defenseman Bitkowski. And their third pick was in the fourth round, 103rd overall, and they took Kucharczyk. So all in all, very interesting pickups here. They got a couple of very shot defensemen, including Murka in round 1, who's a behemoth of a defenseman, is going to be a really solid, scary to play against defensemen in due time. They also added Bitkowski, who I think eventually could be a really solid defenseman, and a center prospect in Kucharczyk, who I think eventually could challenge like 3rd or 4th line center roles. So some very interesting top 3 picks in the 2025 draft from the Buffalo Sabres. Next, going over to the 5 things I said this team should do in the offseason preview video to improve in the offseason and get better for next year. So the first thing I said this team should do in the offseason was to move picks or prospects for forward upgrades. They have a plethora of forward prospects, guys who potentially couldn't even make the NHL roster this year, and guys like Rosen and Ostlund and Wahlberg. Like, they have a lot of really solid prospects. Also had a couple of really decent picks, including their first round picks. So I said this team should move them for instant upgrades, such as guys like Kreider or Zigra or Raquel or McCann. They didn't do that. They lost JJ Peterka, but they didn't lose any of their younger players to get major additions in their top 6 or on the top 4 on the blue line. So that's a big X because they never really added anything. The second thing I said this team should do is to have Levi play at the NHL level this upcoming season. At this current point in time, it doesn't look like he will be. They currently have Alex Lyon, Alex Georgiev, and Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, so that's sort of bumped Levi down to being like the 3rd/4th stringer. And at this point, I think it's more likely that if he's healthy, it'll be a Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen and Lyon tandem at the NHL. So it doesn't look at this point in time like Levi will be playing NHL level minutes, which is a big X on my checklist. The third thing I said this team should do was to consider moving Bowen Byram. They did consider it for some extent, but they ended up signing him to a 2-year contract extension that's going to keep him in Buffalo for at least the next couple of seasons. So not overly great stuff there, and I do think that's another X on my checklist because they didn't accomplish moving Byram. The fourth thing I said it seems to do was to add some veterans. I think to some extent they did that. I mean, they added Georgiev and Lyon, who can be solid veteran sort of mentors on the goaltending side. They added a guy like Connor Timmins, who to some extent is a sort of veteran. They also add guys like Gibson and Danforth, who can definitely be a solid veteran presence. So I think to some extent they added a couple veterans, not as much as I would have liked to see them. So I think they can get a check on that checklist at this current point in time because they added a couple, but didn't as much as I really wanted to. And the fifth thing I said this team should do was to add a defensive-minded top 4 defenseman. They did that. In the Peterka deal, they got Michael Kesselring. He's not going to put you up a whole bunch of points, but he's a very solid defensive-minded top 4 right shot defenseman, which is something I said this Buffalo Sabres team desperately needed. So even though it was my 5th priority, they at least got something done off of the checklist. So very interesting note there, but that was my off-season preview checklist. Next, going over to my projected lineup for the Buffalo Sabres for our 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, my projected lineup looks like this. The top unit is Benson with Thompson and Tuck. The second unit is Kulik with Norris and Quinn. The third unit is Zucker with McLeod and Doan. And the fourth unit is Rosen centering Danforth and Malenstein. I have Dahlin and Samuelson pair 1. Power and Kesselring pair 2, Byram and Timmins pair 3, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen so long as he's healthy starting, Lyon backing up, and Krebs, Greenway, and Jones the 3 spares. That would be a really solid forward group. Like, they have a lot of defensive depth, they have a lot of forward depth, and even goaltending wise, if everyone's healthy, they actually have a pretty decent depth. The Buffalo Sabres team, even though it's quite young and a little bit inexperienced, is actually looking quite good at this point in time. So very good stuff there for the Buffalo Sabres. Next, going over to my predictions for the Buffalo Sabres for 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, I think it might finally be time for Buffalo to celebrate. I don't think they have the greatest of off seasons, and I don't like the Peterka deal, but I think this team will have what it takes, so long as they stay healthy and consistent and don't go on 14-game losing streaks, to make the playoffs for the first time in 14 years. I have them finishing with a record of 38, 28, and 16 for 92 points, ever so slightly sneaking into the last wildcard spot in the Eastern Conference. I think they are finally ready to exercise their demons and to take a playoff spot. I think it's about time for the Buffalo Sabres. Now, I could easily see teams that I have currently missing, like the Rangers, like the Caps, like the Bolts, easily take a wildcard spot from Buffalo. I think they will be able to ever so slightly squeak out a playoff spot, so that's my current prediction for the Buffalo Sabres as current point in time. And next, going over to my offseason grade for Buffalo Sabres. So I don't think the Buffalo Sabres had a bad offseason. I don't like the Peterka deal and a couple of other of the moves that this team made. So I'm going to give them a C+. I think if they had kept Peterka, signed to an extension, and maybe did a couple of other things to improve the forward group a little bit, I would have been able to give them like at least a B rating. But with the Peterka deal and what they did with that, like I can't in the right mind give them anything higher than a C+. I think that's sort of warranted for the sort of offseason Buffalo had. So that's my opinion on the Buffalo Sabres. Next, going over to Detroit. So last year, just like with Buffalo, was a pretty sour season there from the Detroit Red Wings. They at least had a winning record, finishing with a record of 39, 35, and 8 for 86 points. Both only good enough for 6th in the Atlantic, 10th in the Eastern Conference, and 21st in the entire NHL. So once again, they were a bottom half team. They had some good stretches, and they were one of the last teams to be eliminated, but was still not enough for the Detroit Red Wings to finally break through and make the playoffs. So very interesting note there. They had 235 goals for and 259 goals against, so they weren't atrocious on either category, but they were a minus 24, and you want to really see your goal scoring and defense be a little bit better, especially if you want to make the playoffs. So obviously it wasn't ideal for the Detroit Red Wings. Next, going over to their point and goal scoring leaders in the regular season. So in the regular season, Lucas Raymond led the team with 80 points, followed by Larkin and DeBrincat, who both had 70, and then Alex DeBrincat led the team with 39 goals, followed by Larkin, who had 30, and Raymond, who had 27. So very interesting out there, but definitely DeBrincat, Larkin, Raymond were the driving force this past regular season for the Detroit Red Wings offensively. All three of the point leaders, all three of the goal scorers, so very interesting note there, but just it wasn't good enough to get Detroit into the postseason, and they also missed the playoffs, so no playoff stats that I have to go off of for the Detroit Red Wings, so very interesting note there. Next, going over to the Detroit Red Wings offseason additions and subtractions. So it's a pretty decent list here. If you look at their additions, they add Mason Appleton from Winnipeg, Van Riemsdyk from Columbus, John Leonard from the AHL, Travis Hamonic from Ottawa, Bernard-Docker, as we just talked about, from Buffalo, Ian Mitchell from Boston, and John Gibson in a trade from Anaheim. They also lose Vladimir Tarasenko in a trade to Minnesota, Craig Smith, who's UFA, Tyler Mott to PTO to Florida, Joe Snively, who's UFA, Jeff Petrie to Florida, Alex Lyon to Buffalo, Peter Mrazek to Anaheim, Jack Campbell, who's UFA, a 2026 fourth rounder and a 2027 second rounder, both Detroit. So if you look at this team, very interesting movement. They lose a lot of goalie depth. They lose Lyon, Mrazek, and Campbell, who were their second, third, and fifth stringers last year. So they do lose a lot of depth, but they get John Gibson, who's going to be the team starter. He's going to be a massive improvement on guys like Talbot and Mrazek. And even though the Red Wings have a weak blue line, I think Gibson's going to strengthen their goals against. So it's a really big boost there for Detroit. They add Mitchell, Bernard-Docker, and Hamonic on the blue line. They lose Petrie on the blue line. So definitely they add a little bit of depth on the blue line. And I definitely do like the Jacob Bernard-Docker addition. Mitchell will be a call-up option. Hamonic can probably play like 6-7 minutes. I definitely don't think that Hamonic's going to be an everyday NHL defenseman. And then they lose Snively, Mott, Smith, and Tarasenko in the offseason on the forward group, but they add Leonard, James Van Riemsdyk, and Appleton. I think Appleton's going to outweigh any sort of the losses that this team made. JVR can also be a solid top 9 forward. Leonard can be a solid call-up option. They lost Mott, who was a bottom 6 forward. Craig Smith, who was an in-season acquisition. Snively, who was an AHL level player, and Tarasenko, who never really fit well with Detroit. So all in all, some pretty solid additions in my opinion for the Detroit Red Wings, both on the goaltending side, the defensive side, and the forward side. So very good stuff there. Team made 2 trades this past offseason. They acquired John Gibson from Anaheim for Peter Mrazek, 2026 fourth and 2027 second. And then they also moved Vladimir Tarasenko to Minnesota in exchange for future consideration. So some very interesting trades from the Detroit Red Wings this past offseason. Next, going over to the top 3 draft picks in the 2025 draft. So their first pick in the 2025 draft was 13th overall, the first first round pick, and they took left winger Carter Bear. Their second pick was in the second round, 44th overall, and they took left winger Genborg. And their third pick was in the third round, 75th overall, and they took goaltender Pradell. So a very interesting pickups here in the draft for the Detroit Red Wings with the first 3 draft picks. They took Bear in round 1, which I think was a steal. I like that addition. I think Bear long term has the potential to be a solid top 9 forward. They also took Genborg, who I think eventually could be a solid like second, third line winger for the Detroit Red Wings. And then in the third round, they took Pradell, who I think eventually could maybe be the team's goalie of the future, but at the very least be like a tandem goaltender. So very interesting note there, but some very interesting draft picks from the Detroit Red Wings. So very interesting note there. Next, going over to the 5 things I said that this team should do in the offseason to get better and improve for this upcoming season. So the first thing that this team should do was to add a young top 4 defenseman, someone who can play top 4 minutes, who's maybe on the younger side, who could grow with this team and take a little bit of the minutes off of guys like Seider and Edvinsson. They didn't do that. I like the addition of Bernard-Docker, but he's more of a third pair defenseman. Hamnick's a 6'7" defenseman, and on top of that, Mitchell's a call-up option. So the Red Wings didn't add a clear-cut top 4 defenseman. Maybe Jacob Bernard-Docker eventually could become that, but for this upcoming season, they didn't add a young top 4 defenseman, so that's an X on my checklist. The second thing I said this team should do was to move one of Mrazek or Talbot and add a new starter. They did that. Loved that move. The Gibson move was fantastic. They got rid of Mrazek to bring in John Gibson, and he's going to be a fantastic, beautiful addition here for the Detroit Red Wings going forward. So very interesting note there, but that's a check off my checklist because they were able to move one of those 2 guys and add Gibson. The third thing the third team should do was to add a top 6 goal scorer, and they did not do that. So unfortunately, just like with the top 4 defensemen, I was hoping they would get a top 6 addition. Their biggest addition on the forward group in the offseason was Mason Appleton, who I think can be a solid third line forward, but he's not going to be an everyday top 6 forward. So as much as I was really hoping they would do it, they did not add top 6 goal scorers. It's another X on my checklist. The fourth thing that says team should do is to buy out or trade Sherratt, Hull, Kopp, or Tarasenko. They did that to some extent. Like Kopp's on the team, so is Sherratt, so is Hull, but they did move off of the last year of Vladimir Tarasenko's contract. So I'm not going to say they didn't do this because they did do it to some extent, just not to the extent I was hoping they would do it. So I guess that's to some sort of an extent a check mark. And then the fifth thing that this team should do is to add some bottom 6 help. In my offseason preview video, I mentioned Beauvillier, Brazeau, Kopke, and Frederick. They didn't add any of those guys, but they did add some bottom 6 help, like Mason Appleton and James Van Riemsdyk are going to be really solid bottom 6 additions for the Detroit Red Wings going forward. So very interesting note there, but that's definitely a check off the checklist. So very interesting note there, but the Red Wings did complete a couple of things on my checklist, but they didn't add a top 6 forward and they didn't add a top 4 defenseman. So very interesting note there. Next, going over to my lineup, my current projected lineup for the Detroit Red Wings for 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, my projected lineup, it looks like this. I have Jonathan Berggren playing on line 1 with Larkin and Raymond, the Brinkett, Kasper, Kane on line 2. I have Rasmussen with Comfort and Appleton on line 3, and Van Riemsdyk with Kopp and Soderblom on line 4. I have Edvinsson with Seider on pair 1, Johansson with Bernard-Docker on pair 2, Wallinder with Gustafsson on pair 3, Gibson the starter, Talbot the backup, and Watson, Hull, and Sherratt being the 3 spares. And that would be a decent roster. Like, they have some depth on the defensive end. It would be a very young blue line if my predictions came to fruition, but it would be a decent blue line. They definitely have a really deep forward group, and their goaltending looks a lot better. So it's a pretty decent lineup there for the Detroit Red Wings for this upcoming season. Next, going over to my predictions for the Detroit Red Wings for the 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, I think they're going to do the exact same thing they did the last 2 years. They're going to get extraordinarily close to making a playoff spot and just ever so slightly miss out. I have the current predictions for the Red Wings being a 41-36-7 record for 89 points, 11th in the Eastern Conference, finishing 3 points behind second wildcard team Buffalo for that last wildcard spot. Like, I don't think it's going to be a big margin of gap. Like, I could see Detroit sneak into a playoff spot if everything goes right for them. But at this point in time, I just think that even though they got Gibson, their goaltending's a little bit weak, and their defense definitely has holes in it, and I just don't think it's enough to be playoff caliber at this current point in time. So very interesting note there. I could see Detroit sneak into a playoff spot, but at this current point in time, I have them finishing 11th in the East, just out of the playoff spots. Very interesting note there. That's leading into my offseason grade. So I think the Red Wings had a really solid offseason. They improved the defense at least a tiny bit. The goaltending wise, they looked a lot better now that they have Gibson. Forward group wise, not a whole bunch of change, but I definitely do like the addition of Appleton. So I'm going to give them a B- rating. Had they gone that top 6 forward, top 4 defenseman, had they gone that major improvement, I could have maybe bumped them up to like an A-level rating, but I think a B- rating is pretty warranted for the sort of offseason that the Detroit Red Wings had. So definitely, that's my opinion on the Red Wings. That's my opinion on the Sabres. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts. What is your opinions? Do you think that the Red Wings are poised to take another step forward but still miss the playoff spots? Do you think Buffalo will finally end their 14-year playoff drought? Definitely have to get your guys' thoughts on all this. Plus, what is your opinions on these two teams going forward, and how do you think they did this offseason? That is all I'm going to talk for today. Remember to like this video, and if you're listening, subscribe below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to without all of you guys, so if you haven't already, don't forget the subscribe button down below. Don't forget to leave a comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Do not forget to stay tuned for videos coming out in the very near future. Also, the blog, talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that. So check that out. I'll link to that in the description below. Can't wait to see you guys all for next video. See you guys soon.